Hello, my name is Rodrigo. I'm the chair of today here. I'm going to present to you Bartholomew Ryan, professor at the Universidade Nova de Lisboa. And he's going to present his paper called Subversive Joy in the Chaosmos, James Joyce's Revolution. Professor Bartholomew Ryan is a philosophy researcher and coordinator of the Cultural Lab at the Nova Institute of Philosophy at the Universidade Nova de Lisboa. He's currently publishing a very interesting book, 500 pages long, on Fernando Pessoa, and his key interest is regarding philosophy. So Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Lukács, and and he's going to present here some readings on Joyce. His presentation is called Subversive Joy in the Chaosmos, James Joyce's Revolution. So now you are with Professor Ryan.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening from Lisbon. Early evening, 6 p.m. here. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for the presentation, and thank you so much to Mariana and to Lara, my connections over there in Brazil, for inviting me to take part in this wonderful conference. And I would love if we were all present, of course, and we were all together somewhere in Brazil, in between the various talks. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I've had some of the talks have been fantastic, and listening to Luke Gibbons and Caetano Galinda and some of by Ed O'Brien, and discovering today the new translation of Finnegan's Wake that's coming out, which was great news to me. It was amazing. So I didn't know about that. And so without further ado, I'll go into Subversive Joy in the Chaosmos, Joyce's Revolution. In Joycean spirit, I will be surfing around and giving you lots of nuggets and sound bites and various pathways or wakes to traverse as I go on. So I'm coming from a philosophy background, but I've always had a passionate interest in Joyce, being a kind of an exile myself, leaving Ireland over 15 years ago, but never really leaving it when you have Joyce by your side. And he has crept into my work more and more through various other authors. The title, Subversive Joy, I guess is a term that I've come up with over the last few years regarding to various elements of trying to think through philosophy and literature in new ways, the 21st century. And I think Joyce, especially in Finnegan's Wake and in Ulysses, but especially Finnegan's Wake, I think we see a manifestation of this idea of subversive joy. I'll see what I can do over the short time, and I'll try to make it more conversational as I go on rather than reading. Now, when I say subversive, I guess you kind of break up or take apart the title itself. There's a lot in there. And Joyce loved playing with various words, as we all know. I mean, subversive, I choose subversive because it's an underturning. It's a subvert. It's a turning under, and it's joyous. Turning under, I'm thinking now through some of the great thinkers from antiquity up until modernity, when the last or the first words of Plato's Republic, I went down, as he goes down into this materialist intent of going down into the marketplace. And then, fast forward 1900 years later or more, 2000 years later, you have Nietzsche's Zarathustra at the end of the prologue saying, I went under. And literally the word is untergang, going under the earth. This time, not even going down, but going under. And that's something very much intent in Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses, and listening to the one of the talks earlier today about the body. And I very much advocate that about the body if I remember the name, Alaveto, I think is the surname, who I had the pleasure of hearing, and who's translating Finnegan's Wake, chapter 15, as far as I remember, that's coming out next year. So this idea of the body, a living thing, a materialist entity coming out in Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses. So that's what I mean by subversive. It's turning, and of course, joy. Joy is in the profound sense of this affirmation of existence. That I'll talk about a little bit as I go on, but this affirmation of joy that has this element of a joyous, the music element that's very much present in Joyce. And luckily we all have natural born instruments in our voices, and the notes are Joyce's words to bring to life. Very famous, we could think of, if you don't understand me, read aloud. And that's always been the key for Joyce. Read aloud from anyone that comes to Joyce. This impossible book of Finnegan's Wake becomes completely possible when you just read it aloud in any page, and it brings to life this joyous element and this bodily element in joy. And I'm also thinking through of the Spinozist element of joy, when Spinoza says joy is a passage from a lesser to a greater perfection, this movement element. And of course, Spinoza is hanging around Ulysses. He's mentioned by Leopold Bloom, a fellow heretic Jew, who mentions him alongside Marx and Jesus Christ and Mendelssohn when he defends himself in perhaps the one place in Ulysses where he gets angry in the famous Cyclops bar episode, and he brings up Spinoza. And we also see that he has Spinoza on the shelf in his house when it goes to the list in the Ithaca episode. So Spinoza, there's something Spinozistic there also in the word joy. And this vision, okay, so this is it, and also the joy of the five senses, which I'll also come back to a little bit in a moment. And then, of course, you have the idea of chaosmos, the word chaosmos coined by Joyce in Finnegan's Wake, and this is a great emblematic example of two words in one, seemingly opposites, chaos and cosmos, order and chaos coming together into chaosmos, and this love of antinomies disintegrating antinomies and dualities breaking down, always happening throughout Finnegan's Wake. And we see these in various other words. You see these mixture of words in one, of course, in the first few lines alone of Finnegan's Wake, the famous wielder fight his penisolate war, or penis solate war, or pen isolate war. Already you have three meanings: the isolated war of the pen, the peninsular war of Wellington arriving in Portugal to begin his campaign against Napoleon, and then of course penis solate war, the recent war of the penis, this allusion again to the sexual war, betrayal. We have Tristan and Isolde and various other figures through history. So that's just an example of this idea of chaosmos. And you have this again, I apologize, when it introduces the famous Gracehoper, the aunt and the Gracehoper scene in Finnegan's Wake. And let me spinooze you a tale. Again, you have spinooze, again, an allusion to Spinoza, but also a spinning a web, and also something sleepy there as well. This is, we're in the dream book. Let me spinooze you a tale. And apologize is really a curious one, because you have apologize and also disguise and also an apology. This is a defense. So many things happening here in subversive joy in the chaosmos. And of course, the revolution itself is, which I see, given that this conference here is a conference about looking back 100 years later, the independence, the war of independence, the independence and the Civil War onwards, and the beginning of a Republic of Ireland and a divided Ireland. And of course, that divided Ireland is something that Joyce is very aware. Remember the years that he was writing this, from 1914 to 1939, what years? The beginning of World War I, right through to revolutions across Europe, of course, the Russian Revolution, the Irish Revolution, a collapse of empires from the Habsburg, disintegration of various colonies happening, and the birth of new nationalisms and new isms per se as well in modernity, from fascism to communism to cubism to surrealism, all happening. And Joyce's revolution, of course, goes away from explicitly goes away from the revolution that's happening in the Irish revival. Famously, he says the cultic toilet, a little joking of what he thought of the Celtic revival or the Celtic twilight. Instead, it becomes this cultic toilet that he mentions in Finnegan's Wake. Now, let me say, I was just going to show you three quotes as a kind of an inside key. And this, of course, is a code book, looking for the key all the time, or codex book, as Joyce mentions in Finnegan's Wake. And I'll just share the screen here for a second, if you can bear with me. Now, here we have three quotes which were my kind of guidelines as I was going through thinking of what I was going to speak about today in Joyce's Revolution. And there are three quotes from Finnegan's Wake. The first comes in the Shem, the penman chapter. "A nogger among the blankcards of this dastard century, you have become of twosome tweminds, forenenst gods, hidden and discovered, nay, condemned fool, anarch, egoarch, hierarchyarch, you have reared your disunited kingdom on the vacuum of your own most intensely doubtful soul." My gosh. So you have this play of all things. This is Shem, the penman, but also it's Joyce, the revolutionary heretic, playing as well. And again, Spinoza was a heretic as well. All these heretics, and of course, Giordano Bruno, the great heretic, who was burnt for his ideas. And of course, Joyce mentions that in A Portrait of the Artist as a young man. You have the elements here again, when I mentioned this, the subverting happening here, the under, and also you have these antinomies that are present here. And the nogger could be the black one, or the literally, and the blank cards could be the white person, or the bastards. You're playing with the unconscious here, this dastard or despicable century. Of course, twosome twimines, the twosome minds. And actually Richard Carney did a kind of performance event with this title, Twidsome Minds, back in 2016. And this again, bringing in these kind of collapsing dualities, which is a very much an implicit attack on the idea of a Cartesian ego and the Enlightenment per se. And that's why we'll go into the Book of the Dark in a moment, looking into the dark rather than into the light. So it's a subversive critique of these kind of the birth of the science in the 17th century of Descartes right up to today. And you have instead these disintegrating antinomies. And of course, you have reared your disunited kingdom. Instead of united kingdom, there's a disunited kingdom on the vacuum of your own most intensely doubtful soul. And doubt is the thing, as Joyce once said to a friend. Doubt is what should always be about. And there's something that's always, these reconciliations happening are always not quite reconciled. The end of Ulysses, for example, yes, there's a reconciliation, but is there really? Stephen Dedalus leaves the house of Bloom. We never know where he's going to go, goes into the dark. And of course, Molly Bloom accepts her husband back into her bed, but of course she slept with someone else during that day. So these are very unstable affirmations that are happening. They keep up the doubt, and very much a quintessence of modernity. So that's just a little glimpse. And then fast forward 200 pages, in the beginning is the void, in the muddle is the sound dance, and therein after you're in the unbeweist again. Wund Volsi. Without spending too much time on that either, you already see the beginning again, a great, try to understand the style is the substance. And was, again, we're going back to a previous talk today when style is to be taken very seriously with Joyce. It's only about style, but yes, having style is what it's all about, of course. And these are precursors of Joyce, like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, who very much combine both style and substance to make their critique. And both of them were no strangers to humor and laughter. Laughter was of the higher one for Nietzsche, and laughter was what Kierkegaard asked the gods at the end of the first part of Either Or, when they asked him, what would he want? of anything. And he said, the only thing I want is laughter on my side. So laughter, joy, humor are very serious critiques as well as being affirmative. So beginning, you have the bug, the insect, instead of beginning, of course, the allusion to the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, begins the Gospel of John. But here we have in the beginning. So there's an insect there. There's also a bug, something you might think of where you're using to spy on someone. There's a bug in the house, but also something bugs me, something that's troubling, disturbing, annoying even. And Finnegan's Wake can be very annoying. And instead of was, it's is, the eternal present. We're in the middle of things, the present here. And void is another combo like Chaosmos of the void and the word. And of course, remember, in Ithaca, one of the lines that you find is ineluctably constructed upon the incertitude of the void. And that's a citation, ineluctably constructed upon the incertitude of the voids. You have this again, this doubt happening, this kind of unreconciled, but yet that's where you find the creative spark. And ineluctably constructed by the incertitude of the void could well be a definition of modernity, Ulysses, and Joyce's art in general, and beauty. So you have all this together here. And then you have in the muddle instead of middle muddle. Muddle, of course, brings us to that resonance of something that's moist, moisty earth. It's mud. We're inside the material. So this is going under the subversive. And also it's confusion. It's a muddle. Tis a muddle, as Charles Dickens in Hard Times says, tis a muddle, this confusion. So in the middle, and in the middle of things, this idea of in medias res, throwing us into the middle of things, is the sound dance. And therein after you're in the unbeweist again. We have a play with two words in German, the unconscious and the unproved, the unbewusst and the unbeweisen. So a lot going on there to unpack. And then last little word sentence, heresy in paradox lust, which for me also sums up a vision of Finnegan's Wake and his subversive joy. Heresy, again, the heretic is right there, but hearsay, gossip, gossipocracy, a word coined by Joyce in Finnegan's Wake, but the heretic is there. And instead of paradise lost by Milton, it's a paradox lust, the lust or the joy. And lust, of course, means joy or happiness in German. So you have the joy of the paradox or the desire of the paradox, and full of paradox throughout this text. Now, I know I won't have the whole evening to talk about Finnegan's Wake when I've just got to the beginning, but I'll just say here, I'll just take this off now for a moment. I'd like to say just three elements, just 3 or 4 little aspects of Ulysses, to go back to Ulysses as kind of precursors to the revolution in Finnegan's Wake. And then I'll say a few words about Finnegan's Wake again. And at the end, a few words about Joyce in Brazil, which I find really insightful to understanding Finnegan's Wake. And for me, the reception of Finnegan's Wake after World War II amongst especially the Campos brothers and the Concrete Poetry was really a great reading that was ignored or not known about in other parts of the globe, and which we're only catching up with now in other parts of the globe. So Ulysses, there's just 4 little points I'd like to make, is when he calls it the epic of the human body, the idea of Jew-Greek is Greek-Jew, extremes meet. And in the first episode, when Stephen Dedalus says his kind of his 2 great enemies are going to be the Roman Catholic Church and the British Empire, and of course the third could be the danger of a bigoted nationalism growing amongst in his own milieu at the same time. And we see that reaching a climax in the Cyclops episode in the bar, where we meet these very much nationalists who are falling under the same problem as the former masters. We encounter anti-Semitism, bigotry, but of course it's a very funny, very enjoyable chapter at the same time, full of trickery and richness of language and very real characters. So the epic of the human body, well, this really shows what Joyce was trying to do. Remember, Ulysses was written throughout World War I, when literally it was the destruction of the human body in all its forms. So he was really bringing forth the five senses. And one of the tragedies of our thinking in at least in Western philosophy is that our priority of hearing and seeing are the only elements of the five senses in most of Western thought. And here's Joyce now bringing forth smelling, tasting, touching on an equal par as hearing and seeing. You might think of it this way. Probably the most famous iconic line in Western literature, "To be or not to be," that is the question by, of course, Joyce's master, Shakespeare, as Stephen Dedalus, as we encounter in the library, "After God, Shakespeare created most," to quote from Ulysses. But maybe to be or not to be is not the question. The question is, are we flourishing? And that's the idea of this subversive joy in the Chaosmos. Instead of this binary or duality, we're going to break forth into a flourishing of the five senses. And this is the epic of the human body. The Jew-Greek is Greek-Jew, extremes meet. We find this, which is already spoken about in various quarters, not, of course, Jacques Derrida famously ends an essay on Levinas with these words: Jew-Greek is Greek-Jew. And this brings forward the exile, the Jewish century, as Yuri Slezhkin says in a book called The Jewish Century, where he refers to Ulysses as the Bible of universal homelessness. And to quote Edmund Jabez, he says, "Being Jewish means exiling yourself in the word and at the same time weeping for your exile." And you could really put the same thing for the Irishman there. Being Irish means exiling yourself in the word and at the same time weeping for your exile. And again, and then also the third point of what Stephen Dedalus wants to fight against, and I added the third of this new bigoted nationalism. This is a prelude again to Finnegan's Wake. If Ulysses is bringing forward these ideas, Finnegan's Wake is the manifestation of these ideas, or the thing itself brought forward. And it is not for that reason that it's been called formidably the most formidably anti-fascist book produced between the wars, Finnegan's Wake. And that's by Philip Sollers, who says that: an active transnationalism, disarticulating, rearticulating, and at the same time annulling the maximum number of traces: linguistic, historical, mythological, religious. So these are total works. Both of them are total works, Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses. That's hence the Chaosmos, but total works of disintegrating antinomies, of reordering, disordering, chaos within an order. And of course, keeping alive this subversive joy, because remember, Joyce's contemporaries, of course, and his close collaborators at the beginning, like Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Yeats, who supported his work, all three have a change of tone after World War I during the 20s and 30s. Of course, we see them all moving towards the kind of right, where Eliot makes his way towards the four quartets. You have Ezra Pound making his way towards the cantos. Yeats bringing more of a kind of elite dichotomy between the peasant and the aristocracy. And Joyce was celebrating, as Seamus Dean puts across very well in an introduction to Ulysses, I think introduction to Finnegan's Wake in the Penguin edition, where he talks about this disintegration was to be welcomed because it was brought about by the very patriarchal orders. And Joyce is one of these people who's actually welcoming this disintegration to bring about something new. Hence this very revolutionary idea and vision going through the text. The fourth little aspect I'd like to bring in, just because here we are talking amongst each other within the Brazilian context, is the presence of Roger Casement. And I've written elsewhere on Casement, actually in Portuguese, bringing Casement forward as a kind of Joycean hero. And he's mentioned, as far as I can see, the only one mentioned of the 16 executed from 1916 Rising in the Cyclops episode, where Roger Casement is mentioned. Of course, the book is set in 1904, the year that Casement's Congo report is published. And Joyce is very much aware of this and brings forward this Roger Casement figure. Why someone like Casement? Well, there are a myriad of reasons why someone like Casement, who only shows up in a quintessential moment of the book, just after Leopold Bloom is defending himself for what a nation is and how he's Irish, and just before we enter this beautiful declaration of what love loves to love, the affirmation of love by Leopold Bloom. And Casement is this exiled figure. He's the one, as Luke Gibbons beautifully put, the bifocal vision. You might even go further. It's a plural vision, a plurality of the subject, the many selves of Roger Casement, and the masks that he's had to wear in various guises, politically, sexually, nationally, various identities of Roger Casement. And I'll just bring forward another quote by from Roger Casement, which is very much worth bringing to your attention. Let's see now, here we go. This is written by Roger Casement in 1905, in between the Congo and going off to Brazil and spending the next at least 7 years there. And it's cited from Angus Mitchell's biography, Roger Casement, published in 2013. And Roger Casement says, remember, this is in a speech in Antrim, remember that a nation is a very complex thing. It never does exist. It never has consisted solely of one blood or of one simple race. It is like a river, which rises far off in the hills and has many sources, many converging streams before it becomes one great stream. But just as each river has its peculiar character, its own individual charm of clearness of water, strength of current, picturesqueness of scenery, or commercial importance in the highways of the world, so every nation has its own peculiar attributes, its prevailing characteristics, its subtle spiritual atmosphere, and these it must retain if it is to be itself. So the nation is like a river. And of course, Finnegan's Wake is the great river book, or as Harold and Augusto Campos write, the Romance Rio, in the introductions to their publication of the translations of 22 texts from Finnegan's Wake's panorama, The Finnegan's Wake. So you have this nation like a river, this idea, this beautiful vision, very cosmopolitan vision, or maybe we could say chaosmopolitan vision of Ireland and what a nation can be for Roger Casement. Roger Casement might even show up in Finnegan's Wake as Lady Jael's casemate, which I've also written about deep in the final section of Book 3, as the boat sets sail, and you have this idea of the four masters, or Mamalujo, and suddenly you find these kind of unconscious allusions to Roger Casement again in Finnegan's Wake. Now, I don't know how much time I have, but I will say a few things about back to Finnegan's Wake now, as that little kind of a prelude in Ulysses to the subversive joy in Finnegan's Wake. Now, Finnegan's Wake refers to Ireland as Error Land or Era Land. Someone a note for? Okay. There we go. Just good to know how much time I've got left here. So Era Land or Error Land, this is the great book of contamination, or the great book of interpenetration, a term that we find another great reader of Finnegan's Wake is John Cage, the experimental composer of the middle of the 20th century, who I think we'll hear a little bit about from his working partner, Merce Cunningham, I think tomorrow or the next day, I think Thursday, in the idea of sound dance, which I quoted at the beginning of this talk, which turned into a piece of dance under the name Sound Dance. So there are so many ways, of course, to open or to read, or to, is the word read probably not the right answer, but to at least experience this jungle of images, words, openings throughout the text. But we can all agree that it is a book of the dark, or a night book, the Languorous Linguous book of the dark, as it's referred to in the middle of Finnegan's Wake. Now, let me show you something. Here is a page from the Book of Kells, the key row page. If we want to understand what interpenetration or contamination or entanglements might mean, this is what Joyce was thinking throughout the reading and writing of Finnegan's Wake. And of course, he had this copy of Book of Kells throughout most of his adult life, which was an inspiration to him. And you see these very much in the artwork of this 8th century sacred text, the Book of Kells, by monks that found itself finally in Kells in the middle of Ireland, led by Colum Kill. Now, you have this linear and non-linear, the circular, the lines, everything going in and out. You know, you might even think of it somehow, and I'm referring to a wonderful kind of mad talk by an unlikely figure, Terence McKenna, who seemed to get to grips with Finnegan's Wake very well. Also, this idea of the psychedelic and the apocalyptic is both much flowing through Finnegan's Wake, and they're both quite revolutionary ideas coming in Finnegan's Wake. Psychedelic in that non-linear time is everywhere. There's no fixed points of identity. Space and time are being bent. All rules are being broken. Apocalyptic, of course, because this is about the fall of many things. The wake, of course, Finnegan's Wake, is both a fall and resurrection of a body and all bodies. So you have this eschatology happening, or as Joyce likes to call it, escapology, an escapism and also an eschatology, a reading of the dead. So it's no accident that we find so many words from the Egyptian Book of the Dead throughout the text. Probably the first text to really go into a kind of hell in literature was the ancient Egyptians going into the Book of the Dead. So you have this, and there's a wonderful chapter on Joyce and the Egyptian Book of the Dead by John Bishop in his very large, extraordinary book on Finnegan's Wake. Now, another quote from this time from John Cage describing interpenetration. Interpenetration means that each one of these most honored ones of all is moving out in all directions, penetrating and being penetrated by every other one, no matter what the time or what the space. So you have, this is a lovely way of thinking about Finnegan's Wake. Also, this time and space are both there. Interpenetration, which of course, on the one hand, you have this entanglement, but also there's a sexual innuendo here as well, which someone like Joyce would enjoy very much. The spiritual and the sexual are one and the same very often in the artwork of Joyce. So there's no hierarchies going on. It's all being merged in various forms at the same time. Now, the Book of the Dark, the Lingus Longus Book of the Dark. Well, the day begins at night. We have to remember this. This might be the Book of the Dark, but officially at midnight, a new day begins. And this is where we enter the darkness of Finnegan's Wake. Darkness might help us because it blurs the boundaries between things. And this is where Joyce's revolution really starts to get very much an intense pressure inside the book itself. Of course, Vico, who's there from the very beginning of the book, River Run past even Adams from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus, Vico, the vicious circle, the commanding street, or Vico himself. And Vico, at the beginning of the new science from the 18th century, writes, darkness is the material of the science, uncertain, unformed, obscure. Other little hints are kind of deciphering or keys even to Finnegan's Wake are various quotes from the Bible. One is from Daniel. He reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. So we're going back to what I talked about at the beginning, this kind of almost critique of enlightenment, critique of Cartesian dualism, critique of bringing to light. For Joyce, it actually might be reducing. So instead, he's bringing us his interest are people like Giordano Bruno and Nicolas de Cusa and Vico here as guidelines for himself, going into the darkness, to illuminate us. And the men loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. This is the Gospel of John. And of course, evil, being bad, what does that exactly mean? You know, so Joyce can transform that into a modern day context. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation of. And of course, this is a book of interpretations, the last word in stolen telling, as we read in the chapter on the aunt and the grace hoper. And then we have, for God had concluded that all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all, Romans 11:32. Interesting, Joseph Campbell focuses on this quote because of the words 11:32, the numbers, which are crucial in the falling of gravity in Ulysses, but also throughout the whole of Finnegan's Wake as well. And in Ulysses itself, dark men in mien and movement, flashing in their mocking mirrors, the obscure soul of the world, a darkness shining in brightness, which brightness could not comprehend. It wasn't on any map. True places never are. And that's from Melville's Moby Dick, the idea of the planet's mellow map, to quote from Finnegan's Wake. This very shifting, these dark geographies that we're entering in Finnegan's Wake, that Joyce does not want to be put down, but rather to open up into an infinity. And literally, this is a book of infinity. And Stephen Dedalus, when he sets off on his own adventure at the beginning of the Proteus episodes, he does say, I'm getting on nicely in the dark. Funnily enough, in history, of course, as Mariana quoted at the beginning of the opening talk before we began the conference, history is the nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. Well, history becomes historical in Finnegan's Wake, a hysteria and historical at the same time. And what might have been a shame, now it becomes a sham in Finnegan's Wake. And the only quotation which I can find that is unaltered in the whole of Finnegan's Wake and published in the book is this quotation from I've forgotten now, Quinet, Edgar Quinet, a French writer who was translating Herder's Introduction to the History of Humanity. And this was known off by heart by Joyce, and it might also help us understand his idea of history and nature coming together. And this quotation turns up in mutilated form at the very beginning of Finnegan's Wake and the very end of Finnegan's Wake. And I want to keep going, so I don't want to lose my time, but just there it is there. I'll read it very quickly. Today, I'll read it in English. Sorry, I won't destroy you with my French. Today is in the days of Pliny and Columella, the hyacinth disports in Gaul, the periwinkle in Illyria, the daisy on the ruins of Numantia, and while around them, the cities have changed masters and names, while some have ceased to exist, while the civilizations have collided with one another and shattered. Their peaceful generations have passed through the ages and have come up to us, one following the other, fresh and laughing as on the days of the battles. So in short, you see nature, the energy of the world always overcoming or submerging human history, coming again and brought forward, and this laughter and freshness that springs forth from it. So this was really a favorite sentence, famously called the Quinet sentence, that finds itself deep inside Finnegan's Wake. Now, okay, I'd like to say a few words about Joyce in Brazil, because I mean, I could go on forever, and I'm just kind of skipping through. I did warn you before that I was literally going to be surfing in and out to show you this revolution in various elements. And you could spend a whole hour talking about the title, Finnegan's Wake. Of course, I would love to show you all the multiple meanings of the title alone, but it's this idea that purity is not an option. We're all history. History is full of contamination. We are all made. We all carry a history of contamination, to quote Anna Singh from a beautiful book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, which she published, I think, in 2015, that this idea that contamination, again, enabling entanglements. And the title Finnegan's Wake, if we have time another day, that alone deserves a whole talk just by deciphering the multiple meanings of the title Finnegan's Wake. And of course, if we want to think about this Irish Revolution happening, it's worth even quoting the great poem by Seamus Heaney, whatever you say, saying nothing. And I think this sums up the type of Irish artist there. He says in his book, in a poem published in 1975, at the height of the Irish troubles in the collection North, "O land of password, hand grip, wink and nod, of open minds, as open as a trap, where tongues lie coiled as under flames lie wicks, where half of us, as in a wooden horse, were cabined and confined like wily Greeks, besieged within the siege, whispering Norse." Again, another beautiful way of entering or experiencing Finnegan's Wake with the help of poet Seamus Heaney. Now, I'll skip forward and say a few things about just as a kind of a conclusion or epilogue. And most of you in Brazil perhaps already know that, but over the last 3 or 4 years, it's been a revelation to me how Joyce Finnegan's Wake has been read or brought into even popular culture in Brazil much deeper in a way than in Europe or in Ireland. Because after World War II, with Europe in ruins and Ireland really becoming the Iron Curtain and consolidating the power of the Roman Catholic Church, and a place where to really write freely, you probably had to leave oftentimes enough. So rather in Brazil in the 1940s, 1950s, a whole great epoch of modernism was emerging. And I'm speaking this to an Irish audience as much to let them know that Finnegan's Wake was really flourishing, and you mightn't have even noticed, but it was there in your unconscious. So in the 4 little examples, as far as I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, well, the first one is, well, as a prototype, what's going on, the birth of anthropophagia, which Oswald de Andrade in his manifesto Anthropophago, where 2P are not 2P, that is the question, when he really begins this idea of a cannibalist manifesto, eating up the Portuguese language, or eating up the European languages and creating a kind of Brazil. And I feel oftentimes this is what Joyce is doing in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, playing with Shakespeare's language and transforming it, going to war. His greatest war was really with the English language, and creating it and bringing it into a new form itself. And then the second is João Guimarães Rosa, which the great novel, Grande Sertão Veredas, which I believe is going to be coming out in English translation in a few years. I hope the person is doing well. But this also is a romance rio, there's a great article by Augusto de Campos bringing together Finnegan's Wake and João Guimarães Rosa's novel published in 1956. No, and again, a great kind of synchronicity when you have the birth of Brasilia, the idea of this modernist order coming together in the center of Brazil, at the same time, this complete total book, Infinity, that brings Joyce and Guimarães Rosa together in their use of multiple voices, disguises, codes. The language is alchemy. And, Augusto and Haroldo Campos describe Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, or Joyce himself, as verdadeiro alquimista do léxico in the introduction to their book. On the left here, you can see Panorama of Finnegan's Wake, which was published, as I believe, in the 60s. And it's a wonderful way to enter Finnegan's Wake because it has the bilingual edition. You have the original and the Portuguese. And then if the third, of course, is the concretist poetry, most explicitly where you have the Campos brothers and others in the concretist poetry, bringing together and using the verbi voco visual, another word coined in Finnegan's Wake, which they use as a kind of mantra for their own way of writing new poetry, the verbi voco visual. And the noise gander, you can see it there, to beg for a bite in our bark, noise danger, which was a magazine for them as well. So Joyce was very much present in these figures. And the fourth, in the 1970s, you have the great experimental novel Catutau by Paulo Leminski. And the last sentence of that book is an explicit explicit allusion to Joyce, where he himself, Joyce in the second last page, is there anyone out there who can understand me? In the second last page of Finnegan's Wake, and the very last three words of Catatau are "Quem me comprenderá?" Who will understand me? And this book itself, of course, wasn't hiding the fact that Finnegan's Wake was such an extraordinary influence for Paolo Leminski in the 70s. And this book, of course, brings us back to the idea of the Cartesian breakdown. This story, the book by Leminski, of course, is Descartes, an imaginary vision of Descartes going to Brazil at the time with a Dutch expedition, the great figure of modern philosophy, the birth of modern philosophy and duality and the natural sciences, and suddenly finding himself completely disorientated and hallucinating when he smokes some kind of hallucinogen that the indigenous people have given him, and he goes off on a trip literally of language for the next 300 pages. And if someone could decipher that or try to translate that into English, I will give them a few pints of Guinness, to say the least. So there's just four elements of which I'd love to write a book on one day, is that the Joyce in English, Joyce in Brazil, these various forms, because I think he found the perfect readers in these various elements. And of course, as an epilogue to my little conclusion, you find this even in the Tropicalia movement. Someone like Caetano Veloso, a good friend of the Campos brothers, in some of the songs, you find his play with language inspired by Finnegan's Wake. And of course, the Tropicalia movement, the musical movement of the end of the 60s, was a very serious and joyful experience. For me, it's an example of subversive joy, bringing forth the verbi vocal visual. And Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil and all these other figures literally using a playful popular culture of anthropophagia into a great form music, which could be heard by anybody and sang along by anyone. But at the same time, there is an implicit presence, I would say, of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake of subversive joy. So I'll finish on a one sentence by Friedrich Nietzsche, who talks about who the perfect reader is. And he says in Ecce Homo, on the borders of his own madness, his very strange, beautiful autobiography, he says, "When I picture a perfect reader, I always picture a monster of courage and curiosity, also something supple, cunning, cautious, a born adventurer and discoverer." And I think that could really sum up both Joyce and some of these great readers that we found in the 1950s and 60s in Brazil. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bartholomew Ryan. Very insightful, very engaging presentation. So many things to unpack here. I really want to really dive deeper in a lot of small passages that you mentioned throughout the whole lecture, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time. So I will present a couple of questions people asked us in the chat. There are a couple of them. I'm not sure if we have enough time, but I will present some of them. So Professor Victor Alevato asked, he wonders whether you, Professor Ryan, is aware of any translation project regarding Finnegan's Wake in Portugal.
The quick answer, no, I'm not aware.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so second question by Camila Perucci.
But I will say, sorry to interrupt, Rodrigo. I mean, what's even more flabbergasting is that the first edition of Grandes Sertão Veredas in a Portuguese edition only came out in 2019. So there are certain things that have taken a long time. That's just, and I was shocked, and I was at the launch of that in Lisbon at the end of 2019. So Finnegan's Wake, I don't know of any official plans at all for translating to Portugal in Portuguese.
Okay, right. So Camila Perucci asked, she said, "Oh, that's an excellent presentation and close reading. She asked, do you think that characters' independence from the narrator is fundamental to the presence of joy and body in Joyce's novels? She said, she's thinking about the comicity of the interior monologue in Ulysses, for example. What else would you have contributed to this presence?
Okay. I apologize for going on too long. I didn't realize I went way over time. But I think to answer your question in short, I don't think there's an independence. I think, and as Joyce's art evolves, and I've only been talking about Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake and 70 or 80% Finnegan's Wake. So yes, it's a bit different, of course, with Dubliners and the earlier works. But in these, I will again reiterate the interpenetration, the the narrator, the character. There is an omniscient author of Finnegan's Wake. It's already, you can hear Joyce in Ulysses, and you can see the various techniques happening because it's a very much a technical work of ordered, and he's really trying to stand on the shoulders or of various other, of course, the history of at least Anglo-Irish literature, and with nods, of course, to Goethe and Dante and the Greeks. But in Finnegan's Wake, there is utter contamination and interpenetration. So narrator, character, it's all left up to the reader becomes the great interpreter of the work. And Joyce himself, I think, is interpreting his own work after the fact as well. So.
Nice. So we have another question here from Giselle. Let me find it here. Oh, just a second. So Giselle asked, if has the concept of love we read in Joyce's characters changed, or how has that changed in the history of the novel and of society, hyper modern society?
Wow, that's a big question about love. I we don't have much time, but I think love in Joyce, as far as I understand. I mean, you're putting me on the spot here, but there's something very subversive in the idea of love, and something, again, when I quoted from Ulysses, ineluctably constructed upon the incertitude of the void. That could also be a definition of love. So love is a powerful kind of new value, and of course it's an ancient value, and it's a combination of just it's faith, but also a commitment, a decision. Of course, these are so it's a very tough love going on as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but we'd have to have more time to decipher that. And I didn't have time to actually quote the beautiful passage of love loves to love, and God loves everyone. This wonderfully comic, and it brings forward both the kind of the humor, almost the gesture of Joyce, and also the very serious joke happening at the same time. That's again reiterating style and substance come together. But I'd need more time to think about that exactly, the idea of love.
Okay. We still have 5 minutes, and
okay.
I have one question. So it's kind of a follow-up question regarding Giselle's question. Do you think that the final chapter of Ulysses, in which the emphasis on yes, 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 is somewhat influenced by Nietzsche's philosophy? Because there is Nietzsche advocates a new kind of approach to life in which you accept life instead of the negation that the former nihilists like Schopenhauer and so on were doing. And do you think there is something related to that in a kind of influence, accepting life, accepting the bodily experience, accepting passion?
There's definite compatibility there with I mean, the Ye saying, you know, the celebration of the yay saying and the yes to life. This is Nietzsche's, of course, as you know, Rodrigo. It's a reaction to instead of this kind of Schopenhauerian no to life, or what Nietzsche saw as Christianity was a no to life. This is a yes to the earthly existence, despite the fact that we are going to die, despite that there might be a terrible end. But that's the courage, and that might refer again back to love, the courage of saying yes to life despite the impending death. And remember, the very opening episode of Ulysses, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is referred to, and the idea, and there's a different kind of Nietzsche, because of course the Nietzsche that was being appropriated at that time was a very much a Superman, almost quasi-fascist Nietzsche. That was the first readings of Nietzsche, the Hyperborean, as Buck Mulligan says, I'm a Hyperborean just as much as you are. But that's not where Joyce wants to go. Joyce wants to go down into the ground, and Nietzsche is also a complicated figure because there are many Nietzsches. He used the same name, Nietzsche, but each book is almost an overcoming of himself. So that yes affirmation is very much ties in, I would say, an unstable reconciliation of going again. And you remember in also through in Finnegan's Wake, Zarathustra is referred to also in the sides and in the teaching, the school episode, thus spuk Zarathustra. Thus spuk Zarathustra, so spitting out the Zarathustra. So he's playing with the first readings of Nietzsche, which Joyce would despise, that kind of Nietzsche. But the other more subtle Nietzsche is a will to power, meaning an artistic subtlety, an artistic overcoming and plurality of the subject, would be much closer to the Joycean vision, and that kind of Nietzsche, rather than the first kind of very narrow cyclopean vision of that readers had of Nietzsche.
Interesting. So I think that's it. We just have 1 minute left, but we don't have any more questions. So I'd like to thank you, Bartholomew Ryan, professor here, for your very, very insightful, very interesting lecture here. And yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Rodrigo.